welcome to Show and Tell, the first Show and Tell of spring 2015. Happy first day of class for all you university people. And thank you so much for coming tonight. Just want to give a few announcements about our spring semester. The next Confluencenter event that we have is going to be creative collaborations with Band, January 31st, and it's music of the Civil War called Behind the Battle Hymn, and we're really looking forward to that one. It's going to be at the UA School of Music, and check our website for more details on that. 11 a.m. Saturday, January 31st. And then the next show and tell 1 month from now is going to be Wednesday, February 11th. And one of our board members, favorite scholars at U of A, Brian Carter, Africana Studies assistant professor, is going to be doing a really cool sort of augmented reality presentation called Walking the Spirit, Augmenting the Paris Experience. And that's after doing a visiting scholar thing with some of his students over in Paris. So we're looking forward to that. Check out the wonderful articles in this month's Zocalo and on the Arizona Daily Star about tonight's presentation. And we are really excited to have a very special guest here tonight. I'll let our director, Javier Duran, tell you a little bit more about visiting scholar Ben Muller.
Thank you. Where are we? Playground? Bar? What's so quiet in here? Anyway, welcome. Thank you for being here. And for me, it's an honor and a pleasure, a privilege to welcome you tonight to our home away from home, the playground, believe it or not. Once a month, we're here, we gather here. And we're really thankful for the hospitality and the support that playground provides for our kids. And please, a round of applause for our colleagues here at the playground. They work hard. And make sure you get your drinks and food. It's part of the system that we have here. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank the Confluencenter team, which is the hardest working team on campus. And tonight we have here Heather, Jamie, Lisa, Joseph, and Eileen. Thank you all for making this happen. Without them, we wouldn't be here. And let me just say a few words about our speaker tonight, Dr. Benjamin Muller. He completed his PhD in International Studies at Queen's University in Belfast and is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at King's University College and a faculty member in the Center for American Studies at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Muller has published widely on borders, surveillance and identification technology, security, sovereignty, identity, and violence, including 2 books, Security, Risk, and Biometric State, Governing Borders and Bodies, published in 2010, and with Samir Aboud, Rethinking Hezbollah, Legitimacy, Authority, and Violence, ASHK 2012. He has provided invited expertise to NATO, Canadian parliamentary committees, as well as various stakeholder groups, and has taught and given guest lectures in Europe and North America. And I have to say that I met him through his work. I was very impressed with his first book, Security, Risk, and the Biometric State, and I wrote him an email, and he responded. And since 2010, we have a very good working relationship. And right now, we have the honor of his presence here in Tucson for 6 months. And we're working on 3 projects, an NSF Research Coordination Network project, a book project on virtual borders and data migrants, and a security, technology, and society panel on the first week of March. You will hear more on that on our website. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. Benjamin Muller.
Thanks so much, Javier. And thanks to the Confluencenter. It's a real pleasure to be here and see all the work that you do regularly and all the cool and exciting stuff that happens regularly at the center. one of the things I talked to a colleague of mine the other day, and he said, "Well, you're on sabbatical and you're giving a talk at a bar. You really found the right place for your sabbatical." And I wasn't even talking about the weather. So what I want to do tonight is, probably sounds pretty modest, talk about what's the problem, basically drone surveillance, the virtual border, what is it, how did it get here, where are we going, and what might we do about it, or how might we engage with it. So I'll try to do all that in about 20 to 30 minutes, but I'll probably enlist the help of people who are around me. More than likely, have your order, we're going to do some signs, either that will signify that I should tell you to get another drink, which usually when I talk, you don't need to get that, you'll just do that on your own, or that it's time for the road. Oh, there we go. So I wanted to start with this quote. Often when I talk about virtual borders, and there's been a few, I've had the opportunity and privilege of doing a few media things lately, and people are always asking about this, what is this virtual border, what are you talking about? I thought, how do I begin thinking about that? And in a place like this, it's probably easier than a lot. This sort of quote, the border is not where it's supposed to be, I think in some context doesn't really resonate with people very well, but I would argue that in this particular context it probably resonates really well. And so I thought, why not put an image that I'm assuming a lot of you would recognize. Does anyone know what that is? The checkpoints. When I show this to my students in Canada, they look and they're like, I don't know, what is that? And here everyone's, oh, the checkpoints, or that little sort of note in your voice and inflection. So one of the things I really want to stress is that although a lot of what I'm talking about has to do with digital technologies, and a lot of the ways in which the border operates in forms that we often cannot see, I'm in no way trying to belittle or in any way even not also talk about the ways in which the very physical borders also operate. And that we encounter those, and that they're very actually closely related in many ways. And that's something I'll try to get into in a little bit. So here's another sort of recognizable image locally, is the fence, the wall, whatever people want to say. And I like to use this quote because I think it makes some nice connections that's very close within my work. One of the things that I often try to talk about is the way in which what happens at the border doesn't stay at the border. And it's not only about the border, but it's actually about a whole series of other things. It's not about a line between a politics of out there and a politics of in here, but it's actually where those things are meeting in sometimes very violent ways. As the quote suggests here, every time something happens in Iraq, in this particular quote, suddenly there's a kind of security response at home. Bollards being, a sort of more British thing, they like to put those around, but certainly I know the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa has been doing some of them as well. What's interesting, I think, as well, is the way in which the book itself is titled Indefensible Spaces. And I think that's an important part to start. So sort of, how did we get here? How is it that we started having to deal with these kinds of issues in the way that we're now dealing with them? And one of them is clearly this. Something happened on 9/11, and there was an immediate response that should never happen again. And basically it was, really, come hell or high water, that's not going to happen again. No matter what is going to have to happen in the meantime in order to make sure that does not happen. And in part of that, it had to do with a particular take on risk assessment. And there was an incredible risk aversion. That in fact, there was no level of risk that was going to be okay. That any risk was too much risk. And so that led to a particular sort of response. And that response, in the immediate, and certainly we see that in all sorts of ways, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about now, is a way in which we started to look at, we need to start watching everyone. Because we don't really know who's going to do this again. There's some people who managed to do this with things we didn't think people could hijack planes with, and do things that we didn't think was possible, and it seemed they were here quasi-legally, and all these other things, and so all the sort of networks we thought we had weren't working. And so what do? How can we cast the net wider? Let's started to maybe watch everyone a bit. And so, and this is one of these actually campaigns to kind of challenge that, because if you see smaller, it says Carol is mother of three, not a terrorist. But of course, all of us who have traveled through an airport realize, that you may be an elderly person with knitting needles and you may be treated in ways that you didn't think were appropriate, but that's in the name of security. And so there's a particular discourse surrounding this that has allowed for a whole series of behaviors and things to occur. Now this happens in a context, and this context is very, very important. Very important in terms of how we move forward and thinking about what a virtual border is, and something else I'm going to talk about, which is a data double. Now, how many people in here do not use Facebook or Twitter or any social media? That's why I said do not. Okay, so the first thing is I can say is you should not be comfortable. You should not think that that was a good decision because now you are going to be preserved in having privacy ensured. Because a colleague of mine in Europe was not on Facebook, has never used Facebook, never created a profile. After struggling for 5 years to get information about himself, he was finally granted in the neighborhood of 2,500 pages of information about him that Facebook had. And he had no use of Facebook whatsoever. So that's one of the first things. As you notice, not many people put their hands up. We are creatures of an information technology world. And why wouldn't we be? We don't have to go across the city, we can just order a book and so on, and everything's very easy. In fact, Amazon even starts telling us what books we ought to be ordering because of the last 3 we ordered. And so it's starting to create that very nice profile of us, even if we may have ordered a book for someone else. So that dynamic happens. Now the other thing to think about is how good a representation or how legitimate a representation that profile on Facebook or Twitter or your dating website or whatever else it is you might be using happens to be of you. I'm sure, the old statement that the closest you ever get to perfection is on your own resume is probably a good case in point here. That sometimes how we look in certain contexts is not a very good representation of ourselves. But increasingly, an enormous amount of decision making is being based on that particular sort of profile. And maybe we think we can throw it off by doing something different, Facebook or what have you, but the point is, that's the kind of digital data that's being mined, if you will, by a whole series of people. And that's one of the complications. If you look at some of the other images here, I've intentionally placed the kind of corporate logos. Because if it was just the state we could target, particularly in liberal democracies, that would be somewhat easier. Because we could say, hey, what kind of stuff are you keeping on me? We have Freedom of Information Acts, we have Access to Information Acts, and we could start to kind of hammer away. But as we well know, that's a very, very small piece of the puzzle. Because Facebook is not owned by the United States government. It's an individual actor, just like all sorts of internet service providers are private actors within a market. And they may or may not choose to give up our personal information that we voluntarily given because, well, it was just a lot easier than filling out my data. If I click this little box and use my Facebook profile, well, then I can access that other thing a lot quicker. So we see how very quickly all of this kind of starts to amass. Now, the other dynamic that's a big part of the background here is that really big amorphous term globalization. It's important to remember that 9/11 occurred at the end of a decade that was a kind of, Thomas Friedman wet dream about this, whatever the earth happened to be at that time. I don't know if it was flat yet by the end of that time, but he was talking about all these ways in which, people were either having Lexus or sitting under olive trees. And something that was happening is technology was expanding outwards to the developing world. Whether or not this, was necessarily bringing equality and so on is something, that we debate, and I'm not talking about here. But there's a few really important dynamics about that. The first point is, where is it that our data is currently being managed and currently being held in many cases? It's very often in the developing world, in places that may not have the same kind of levels of oversight that we would expect in our own societies. So that's an important part of the dynamic. The other is that in a post 9/11 context, certainly the sorts of parts of government that the West, and the United States in particular, was cozying up to was often the military or police within those states, not often the engineers of social change. So those two things mean that so we've got a lot of our data in places without oversight. In fact, now there are a greater number of internet users in the developing world than in the developed. So that's an important dynamic that we need to keep in mind here. So, getting back to the border, what does this all mean? Well, this brings us to this idea of a virtual border. Now, first of all, there are ways in which the border is being crossed by all of us at times when we're not even aware. So I can give you a particular Canadian example. If you book a flight, for example, from Toronto to Calgary, all of your personal information will be transferred to the United States. Because your flight will enter U.S. airspace, and so you are then subject to all U.S. watch lists, as they're called. So no-fly lists, these kind of strange lists where we think these are perfectly reasonable people to live in society, work, eat, do whatever, but for some reason we don't think they should get on airplanes. So that's one dynamic, that's one. And, so we're sitting there on Expedia, booking that flight. Already, our information is crossing borders. We're not aware of it. Partly, none of us probably read all that fine print. We just tick the box quickly, come on, agree, get this done, I want to book the flight. And so meanwhile, it's saying it's going here, there, and everywhere, and there's all sorts of pre-assessment going on. But the other, of course, is what our state's doing is they're saying, you know what, that's kind of cumbersome. In fact, they're starting to realize that your passport is really crappy, to be honest. I mean, most of us can make a reasonable approximation of one on our printer at home. So what do we need? How could we make something better? Well, what we need is this category of the trusted traveler. It takes us back to that image of Carol. We don't want to keep referring to Carol as a terrorist or Dave the accountant as a terrorist. We need to figure out how can we start categorizing people, or what in the literature on surveillance they call social sorting, which we all experience in very simple ways when we suddenly decide to pull out the gold card at that certain store and we get to the front of the line or we get invited to the special sale on Wednesday night. Those are one aspect of that social sorting, but of course there's a whole series of others that occur based on your occupation, based on your zip code, etc., etc. And so the idea of the trusted traveler for governments became a kind of silver bullet. So they decided, okay, we need to create some sort of cards, and the thing is, what we'll do is, the candy will be, everything becomes easier once you get this card. And this is where I said earlier, the physicality comes into the discussion. So when new border facilities are built, and certainly in the North American case, this is completely true, both Canada, the US, and Mexico, there is not the same number of normal lanes, whether that be in an airport or whether that be a physical land border, added in the same proportion as there are lanes for trusted travelers. The idea being that you're always going to be in that long line waiting and seeing those other people buzzing by, saying, you know what, like as much as, threats are being blocked already. Hence, I don't have Facebook, and there's a good example that I'm not safe. So, I mean, that's one aspect, is to kind of demonstrate it physically to say, okay, here you've got your trusted traveler card, now suddenly you can go more rapidly. But the point is, what that trusted traveler card allows is it allows for a constant assessment. In other words, again, you have the card in your pocket, and maybe you're not crossing the border for 6 months, but you are constantly being assessed, you don't even know when. And that's the point of it. Because particularly at land borders, it's a problem. Most of us don't fly airplanes, so we can't just show up at an airport and fly ourselves. So we book a ticket, and so there's some time there. So people can start looking into things. But at land borders, what officials really hate is people just show up. They suddenly wake up in the morning and say, you know, and if they're Canadians or Mexicans, they say, let's go shopping, because that's what we do. I often go to the Tucson Mall and see either Canadian or Mexican license plates. So, you know, that's clearly the same on either border. But that's unpredictable. But this makes it predictable. So things like Nexus and Sentry have become very inexpensive, and there's a very, very big impetus to promote that to occur. But you are in effect crossing the border all the time. Crossing the border every time that someone decides to do that checking on you to maintain that information. Now the other dynamic, and this is something in the same way that I showed that checkpoint, and everybody here knew a sort of, you know, side of it, and my students have no idea. When I show this image, entrance to the USA, often I find in these contexts down here, not everyone necessarily knows what that is. Now the first sort of clue is, of course, it's also written in French, which is Canada's other official language, and so you may not realize, but you also, in a sense, have checkpoints in every major Canadian airport. So as a Canadian traveling to the United States through our airports, we actually cross into the US in our own airports. And there's a nice plastic Statue of Liberty standing there. And a few years ago I went to Disneyland and they forced my wife to consume an apple in front of it because she couldn't walk any further with that apple, even though we were actually in Toronto the whole time. So it's a great example again of where the actual, all the ways in which the technology and this force to pre-assess us actually has concrete physical changes to the border. So in this case, there are extraterritorial borders. Now, that's as much as I'll say on that because one of the promises I made to myself and to Javier is that I won't go all like political science geeky and start talking about sovereignty the whole time. Now, there are a whole variety then of other gadgetry that becomes used in the border in kind of maintaining that special, you know, kind of digital, virtual border and ways in which that data double of ours. So again, remember, what we have to think about now is the ways in we're sitting here, but that data double is moving around. And that's, you know, a whole collection of where you've traveled, who you've phoned, what you've purchased, when the last time you updated your passport, all those things that is creating a particular profile, which may or may not be a reasonable approximation of you. So the item on the left here is something of interest because it's actually developed here at the University of Arizona. It's called Avatar, Automated Virtual Agent for Truth Assessment in Real Time. Now, truth assessment, in other words, its stated aim is to detect deception. Again, going back to that image of Carol as a terrorist, something that changes at that time, and I've heard stories tonight, and every time I talk, in fact, when I teach courses on the border, I always start with first aid, which is, everybody tell me your border story, because everyone wants to tell border stories. And a story that's common is people talking about years ago, and they, you know, and that's the same at the northern U.S. border as it is at the southern U.S. border. Talking about no border, effectively. People walking across, camping, doing this and that, in the way in which that changed. Well, that changed, and that continual change led to a point where mobility itself becomes questionable. The fact that you're at the border already is a cause for suspicion. And so that's why you have the development of something like Avatar that says the precise idea here is to detect deception. And it's very important, as someone who studies technology, not as, unfortunately, NPR referred to me today as a high-tech expert. I don't, you know, if you saw me help my kids with math, you'd realize I'm very far from that. I'm a social scientist and, you know, liberal arts scholar who is looking at technologies. And so what's very important to me is the way in which, who developed them, for what purpose, and with what sort of assumptions. And so that's very important. Something like this, the assumption is this is going to a place where deception happens, and it needs to detect it. Now the other points, of course, we have things like facial recognition, which has actually become basically the gold standard within passports. From a high-tech standpoint, not terribly, well, that's okay, I'm really loud. People speaking of high-tech. So, facial recognition is something that is not terribly reliable, but it's nonetheless been used, and it's a good example of where the politics actually had more to do with the decision than technology. And another part of this story of the virtual border is that the issue is not whether or not something is effective. If you're stuck on the question of efficacy, you're stuck in the wrong place. And I'm sure many of you who read local news saw last week that there was a big report that the drones, were terribly ineffective, or rather that the kind of cost-benefit analysis was very poor. I would argue that that will likely have little to no impact on the actual decision. Because a great majority of this is not about actual security, because actual security in that sense, if we really want it, well, what we're doing is fighting what the border actually is. Because the border is porous, the border has to be porous to function, or it's not a border. Then it's just we're sealing ourselves off. And of course, the immediate response to 9/11 demonstrated how catastrophic that can be if you simply close the door. And so that's really, even people who are arguing in favor politically of higher walls and so on, deep down would not argue for those things, because those people are also often interested in the economy. And the economy suffers significantly. So when we're thinking about these things, it's not about that. It's about a notion, or as some people call it, a theater of security. A way in which we might feel more secure. And that there can be this kind of virtual border, the more we can conceal it so we don't actually know that's happening. And with the Nexus or Sentry card in our pocket, we don't know it's happening. And so we feel better. Or even architecturally. And I took that slide out because I thought I had too many slides, but even the way in which border facilities themselves are being redesigned are there specifically to conceal the technologies. And so, for example, in Washington State recently, the border facility there, the US government chose to hire the same company that designs the Apple stores to, in fact, try and make it look more like an Apple store. We all, unless you're there, like I was a couple weeks ago because my computer didn't turn on, aside from those people, everyone else feels kind of good, it's cool, it has this neat aesthetic. And then they talk about the way in which, secondary inspection is more like going into a business transaction. So I don't know what business transactions involve that rubber glove, but the other point then, of course, we have the drone. And the drone, my fault for putting drone in my title, because drones are hot these days, and so drones become a major discussion, but also good timing because that report came out, and there was just greater expenditure, and now apparently CBP has $10 billion more to play with, no doubt some of which will be going towards drones, irrespective of the report. But drones are also, we have to remember, a military technology. And if we get back to that idea of introducing technologies, who designed them, what were the assumptions behind them, and what are their intended use, that becomes very important when we start bringing those things into civil spaces. Now, I just want to briefly talk about two quick stories here about individuals who confronted the virtual border in very important ways. In one case, quite a dialogue. The person on the top right-hand side is Meher Arar, who Canadian citizen in 2002, transiting through New York City, was then taken aside into secondary inspection and subsequently put as part of the extraordinary rendition process, sent to Syria and tortured for over a year. He was subsequently finally, and this was a grand failure on the part of the Canadian government, finally taken out after that long. Then there was a large public commission, which Canadians spent and he was awarded over $10 million in terms of dealing with that. So that was a big process. The United States has still not taken him off the no-fly list. People are saying I need to move around. That's okay, I pace all the time. So that's one. Other, Ellen Richardson. So this was in 2013. So what happens to Ellen is actually, in the end, the actual consequences aren't as bad, thankfully, but what happens is arguably more pleasant. In the case of Meher Arar, it's very clear, Canada was sharing information with the United States. He was of Syrian descent, so lo and behold, he had all sorts of long-distance phone calls to the Middle East. He happened to have travel patterns there, and although he was also like a tech expert, so that was enough. So his data double basically fell into a category of suspicion. Off he went. Cost Canadian taxpayers $10 million in damages. Ms. Richardson, what happened to her was she arrives at the border and they say, sorry, you can't come to the United States. And they don't immediately tell her why. They just say, go home, you're not allowed entry. She's booked herself on a nice cruise, she's got her passport, everything seems to be in order, doesn't seem to be a problem. What happens finally, well, they say, okay, what the problem was is in 2012, you actually were put into a psychiatric institution. And in 2009, you attempted suicide. So on the basis of that information, we can't let you into the country. Now, on the face of it, of course, in the same way that borders have always been porous, borders have always also been about keeping out quote-unquote sick bodies. So this idea of sick and healthy bodies, that's one of the ways in which the passport even comes up. It's about trying to deal with the movement of disease. But in this case, of course, her initial question is, how could this happen? Why is it that, I'm disallowed to go on a cruise because I had some psychological problems in the past? But the other point is, how the hell did the United States know this? How did this happen? Well, all of a sudden, all these little things get traced, and it turns out every time there's an attempted suicide in Canada, it gets reported to our federal police institution, which is called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and no, they're not on the forces anymore, 20 years. And so that occurs, and everything that they do gets shared with the FBI. And that just happens. And so all of a sudden, this individual confronts this. And it's like, oh my God, how did this happen? And so there is this kind of ongoing discussion about that, but there's really no recourse at the end of the day. Because any state is allowed to have any kind of regulations that it wants. So now the other problem is I left my flood flurry to, but maybe it's arranged this work anyways. Now, those people, however, are luckier than these people. I have to talk about drones because I put it on here. The way, good thing I'm loud. Okay. So something that you notice is I wanted to have this animated. It's actually a very good kind of one of these infographics that's animated. What it shows is from 2004 until 2013, all drone attacks in Pakistan. And it's broken down into a variety of categories. As you can see, that really bright red on the left is children. The next red is civilian. The very far right, which you can barely see, is high-profile targets. And that 2,453, which is the vast majority, is basically unknown or other. Now, there's a few reasons to show this. The first is, when we're thinking about drones, I would argue we do need to think about this. It's a military technology. This is how it has been used for that number of years already, very effectively for that particular job. So to take that out of the discussion, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The other point is, why is there such a great large category of other? Well, the reason that is because what we're doing is getting data doubles. We don't actually know who those specific individuals are. But what we do know is that they go to certain places, they're friends with certain people, they happen to have certain other patterns about them that make them suspicious. Or they were maybe with a high-profile target. It's like, well, if you're with if somebody in here is really nasty, well, what the hell are the rest of us doing in here? That's basically what that category is. So it's a good example, again, of the use of the data double. And the way in which that data double is, in this case, actually state violence is being exercised. Now, this is a really great exhibit because something I said that, as I went through the talk, I tried to talk about where did we come from, how did we get to this, where are we now, and what can we do about it? Well, I think there's a variety of things that we can do about it as individuals. I think this is a very interesting approach. And this is this Blue Sky Days, Thomas Van Hoyters. These are drone images of events in the United States that are actually the same sort of events that drones generally target. So we have a wedding, we have people at a sports event, we have people in a kind of public square. So a few things to note. First of all, maybe it makes us think a little bit differently about drones when we see that. We see that context. That's the sort of situations that we're hitting. The other point is, of course, is to see how they actually look differently when viewed with a drone. people may not have recognized immediately that that was a wedding photo, or that that's a baseball diamond or a town square. It may not become obvious right away, because it has a kind of sinister edge to it. And the drone views things in this kind of sinister way. And I think that's another case. The once we introduce military technologies into these kind of spaces, we can't imagine that all of that doesn't sort of come along with it. Now, the other point is, and this came up in a lot of the interviews I did this week, in the last couple of weeks with the media and so on. But first is sort of, where are we going? You know, future telling, which academics always love to do very much, especially when we're not quantitative people, so we have no models. So, and the other point is, like, why is it that people aren't all up in arms about this? Well, the one point is, of course, convenience. That's one of the reasons we're not up in arms. Because if I pull that little card out and I get to go past the line of 50 people, then, you know, I know what's happening probably deep down inside, but maybe I'm willing to overlook it. But the other part is, of course, the way in which these things become normalized. So, I mean, I took a picture of that in the New York Times, the Bloomingdale's ad, that was for Black Friday. So, you know, they're advertising drone on, which is probably what I've already been doing for too long. You know, it suddenly becomes a gadget fun to buy your kid. And the whole way in which the whole kind of baggage that comes along with that technology completely leaves it, and we start to forget about all those things. The other is in terms of thinking about the future and where we're going. Well, something that came up in the 9/11 Commission report was a failure of imagination. So for me, something that we have to do is maybe look at other places, because clearly, you know, rooms filled with, you know, old white men in blue suits have failures of imagination, so maybe we should look elsewhere. One place we can look is within popular culture. And popular culture has played a really big role in terms of creating kind of receptive context for these things. The picture on the top right is from Sleep Dealer. I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the future, but I think it may not be all that far off. I think the idea thereof, the technology having within itself kind of very, you know, extreme power is an important aspect. The other minority report, and this is, I feel like, you know, years ago this was like a big deal, now it's probably called hum, of course. Because this is the idea of pre-crime. We're trying to pre-assess everyone and their data double. What is the point? The point is not to say because you did A, B, or C, it's because we think, given all these other factors, you might do A, B, or C. And so we're making judgments based on that. And the border increasingly is a site where that happens. And as I said at the very beginning, something that's really, really important to me is the way in which what happens at the border doesn't stay there. So those sorts of approaches, if they're deemed to be legitimate there, we ought to assume that we're going to see those sorts of things elsewhere. Thank you.
You mentioned algorithms. Can you tell us some examples, I guess, an algorithm, like a category, maybe? Do you have any idea of what sort of algorithms are used to profile those services?
Well, I don't. Everyone get the question?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know exactly like what are the like 10 things that need to go in that if you do those things that will feed into the machine, if you will. What I do know is that the company that's responsible for making the algorithm and providing it from Amazon is also involved in doing the algorithm for the terror watch list. Now I don't know if that makes you happy or frightened or not, but I think for me it highlights a few things. First of all is obviously the imperfection of it, and secondly that the other dynamic here is the constant interaction between the public and the private, which makes it more difficult. As I say, if it were just, you know, an angry dude on the street with a gun with, you know, the state written on him, we can deal with that. But this is all sorts of other things we do. So we like it from Amazon, but now they're also getting, you know, more profits and then able to provide it there. But I don't know the specific parameters, and I would assume that that's probably proprietary, so they wouldn't be giving that out anyways.
Ben? Justin here. Oh, in the back. Okay. So I have a question related to the Trusted Traveler Program. So we're standing here in the bar, maybe 100 kilometers from the border, and there may not be a lot of daily classes in the room, but there are a lot of daily crosses. And we're willing to make that counseling bargain, and deliver the data to the government to get across back and forth, and not have to give up an hour or 2 hours in either direction. So really the question is, at what point, so there's going to be a filter, your personal data is out there, you assume the government already has it, and you're going to pay for a privilege to cross. So really my question, so what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you're expressing the kind of catch-22 nature of this. I mean, I have a Nexus card.
Hey, how you doing?
Given what I know, and I have one of those cards.
So there's obviously some answer. What you need to do is this.
Yeah, I know.
I think what needs to happen is if there's greater pressure, and there's a whole series of reasons why it's very difficult for this pressure to be exerted. But there needs to be greater pressure to be placed on why can't the border function better for all of us? Why is it that it can only function really well if I'm willing to, so that the FBI knows what I eat for breakfast every day, and I pull it out of this little RFID sleeve and I start submitting, and now it works good for me. But it doesn't work good for the huge line of people. And as I said before, like in all sorts of physical ways, the border is even being altered to make it work even better for me, but even worse for others that make sense. And this is, it's very clearly laid out in like TSA literature and things about this multi-lead strategy and stuff. So I think that's really the only way through. But you're right, all of this stuff, that's the candy, is access and convenience. And that's what we need.
It seems to me like there are a lot of efforts being exerted to make these data double better. I'm sure you're probably aware of the Guardian was a recent article on a study where they showed that based upon people's Facebook likes, they could actually predict their personality as well as host personality and very thorough personality tests. Far better than people can do and really look at those themselves. So I'm wondering, as technology proceeds, data doubles get better to some extent, and then the result of it.
Right. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, the question was about data doubles, and that increasingly data doubles are getting better. And so, where are we going from here and so on? Let me say the first point isn't necessarily to criticize whether the data double is good or not. I'm not necessarily even interested in that, to be honest. And I think with technology, you're absolutely right. And we're so immersed within information technology, the data double will get better and better. There was a story, for example, a couple of years ago with Target. Target is all sorts of, you just use your Target card, they do all sorts of profiling and so on. And a gentleman was in there with his daughter. They went to pay for things, and they handed his daughter a whole series of coupons and samples and so on for prenatal vitamins, baby powder, diapers, and so on. And the father was appalled. He got very angry and said, how dare you do this? Can you see this is my daughter? She's however old, etc. And the next day he phoned the management of Target to apologize. Because actually Target knew that she was pregnant, but he did not. And so so we can say, the data double is great. But for me, what the problem is not how good the data double is. The problem is I have no idea what my data double is. How do I find out what my data double is? A, how do I figure out how many decisions are being made on the basis of my data double? Because that's the question of social sorting. There's differential access being given, and we don't even know why, because it's all happening outside of our own control. So that's, I think, the issue. But you're absolutely right. It will only get better.
Excuse me. It is that as the technology is becoming more well-known in this country, as we've seen it's becoming much better known in other countries as well. So that the information being traded between countries, it's just passed along. You talked about the drones and showed the graph of the attacks and the various groups of people that were affected by that. Right now, most drones seem to be being used by the United States. what's going to happen when that technology becomes available to the entire planet, as it is that are we becoming safer with this technology, or are we dooming ourselves?
That's okay. There's just a couple of points there. Well, that's okay because I'm actually my training's in international relations, so I can put that hat on. Let me try and answer that quickly. The use of the technology to discipline developing states, and as technology becomes increasingly cheaper, one ought to expect that developing states will take on the technology and also use it. That's what I would say.
Are there statistics on the number of people in the other category with drone strikes that are in the data?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the difficulties with drone strikes is data full stop. So that infographic is produced by, at the moment, I can't think of their name. It's a very good NGO that's done a lot of research. But aside from that and a couple other groups, it's hard to get any data on that. As I'm sure you're well aware, I mean, the drone strikes often are actually executive order. They're in a sense, they're it's exact arm of sovereign power. It's not military and so on. So in those ways, you don't even have the production. So these are people on the ground working for NGOs trying to gather information. So they would have to basically move back with the people who are making the decision and figure out, is this who you thought you hit or something? And I don't think for probably more political reasons that move hasn't completed.
You use the word effective when talking about drone strikes. Can you be a little bit more specific as to what the word effective, what the word effective means in that context? And I would like to hear your thoughts on having an open border with Canada and Mexico.
All right, I'll answer the second question first. So, because that's, as someone who studies the border, you inevitably get asked, what's your answer? Is your answer an open border?
I don't know.
I can, sort of plead the fifth. I'm an academic. My job is to give you an answer. But that's a crappy answer. So the other side, I would say a well-functioning border is one that enhances mobility. It is not one that is preoccupied with stifling mobility. So an open border, well, I mean, there's all sorts of literature on that shows the way in which it's effective. You can look at the European Union. As it expanded, God, the Germans were crying out, oh no, like now Schengen is going to Greece. All those lazy Greeks are going to go running up to Germany and stealing our jobs. No, it didn't happen. When they opened the borders, everyone didn't all run around to different countries. Because why? Because they have families, they have homes, they have lives. So they don't, in fact, all take off everywhere. Now, the other question about effectiveness of drones, when I use that term, what I was meaning is for their intended purpose. And I mean, to be honest, I mean, it's a no-risk kill machine right now. And I mean, from the perspective of strategic studies, once you take out your own, potential of loss, you have to, increase its capacity in order to strengthen your own resolve in the face of the enemy. So, I mean, that's what it's being used, and it's being used extra legally. So, I mean, in all those ways, yes, it is effective, quote unquote. I'm not attaching any normativity to my version of effectiveness. But.
Thank you.
So you said that there's data held and managed in other parts of the world. I wonder where is that happening? Is our data somewhere else? The other part of that, or another question would be with the current trend in data collection, how do you foresee the use of technology that's implanted in people's bodies in order to either track or
super sci-fi one. So that, I'll go with that first. I mean, because already RFID chips are used in people in some cases. And so again, I don't think that's like beyond the realm of possibility at all. Biometrics is all about your physiology becoming digitized, and so your body is itself becoming the password in that sense. So you don't need to implant anything, you are the implant in that sense. And in that sense, I mean, another, Joseph Bubiacy has talked about this very well, and the kind of history of that and so on, but it's like you're the appendage in that way of it itself. The other question in terms of management of data, well, I mean, the one would be phone a helpline. Who's on the other end? Where are they? Ask them what the weather's like. So I mean, that's one. I mean, obviously India is a really huge one with that. I know in the Canadian example, interestingly, the province of British Columbia, its health records were outsourced to the United States, to a US company, which you may be surprised, many citizens were outraged by it, because the United States, unfortunately, has very weak data protection legislation in comparison to Canada. And so those kind of concerns arise, but obviously developing states, those sorts of things are even lower, because in the terms in the role of development, data protection legislation is pretty low on the list of priorities. And so it's simply outsourcing the management of data to those kinds of places. And they're often, then they're involved in problems and so on, and how do we clear pressures, or, I mean, when you said implanting, we're talking about them implanting things in the technologies, and that is happening.
So would companies, like, you get those things in the mail that say, this is what we do with your information, this is how we protect it. Like, would there be some motivation for them to look toward outsourcing their whatever that would give them the ability to share your information more easily?
Like a credit card company. I don't really know the answer to that. That's a good question.
In most cases, they don't disclose how long they keep data. That's one of the difficulties. There are some bits of legislation. I know in Canada, there's, depending on who's holding it, they have restrictions on getting rid of it. But then there's been regular scandals about them discovering that data, 2 or 3 times longer past its sort of sell-by date. It's one of those issues where, unless I can see the screen, I'm not convinced that even if there's some legislation that's saying that that's got to be right, that it always necessarily is. And I mean, computer people always tell you it's never really right in that sense either. The other thing is there's a lot more people working on the side of, increasing watch lists and so on and adding people than there are removing people, for example. So in terms of the oversight and dealing with errors and that stuff, that's not a lot of resources will need to go into that. So I mean, Ted Kennedy was on the no-fly list, and it took Ted Kennedy 3 months to get removed from the no-fly list. So I mean, that might just give you an indication of sort of where the emphasis is being placed in terms of adding information as opposed to pulling it out. Because I mean, one of the images that was used in the Zocalo magazine was of a U.S. Marine using what's called the biometric automated toolkit to actually input basically anyone they come across. It depended on different tours, but in some cases, anyone they would come across in Iraq or Afghanistan and input it. And that was one of the questions, like, how long do you keep this? And like, where is this giant database and what is it for? But it seems that for a long time, and I know others have discussed this, and actually one of which is Mark Salter, who's actually also going to be coming here in March, is that data itself became equated with security. So it didn't matter what it was, just so long as we have more, it's better. Even if we don't know what to do with it.
Well, there's probably like the simplest dynamic for that is, you know, that one of the reasons
risk assessment becomes popular in government is because it's a way that you can argue for more funds. And borders is a great example because you can always say what you have is working because you can't usually prove its ineffectiveness unless you have a catastrophic failure. But you can also say you always need more because, you know, we checked 1 out of 9 cars and we found this many contraband, so naturally we had the capacity to check 1 out of 6. And so we need more resources. Or we did this. So because you can't really falsify it unless, you know, unless something blows up and you can say, oh no, we missed that, so clearly there was a problem, it allows for a constant argument for more resources. The other thing is, and I know this more so in the Canadian case because of my research, but the minimal research that I've done in the US case as well, the border agents themselves tend not to be very supportive of these technologies. And it's not simply a question of they see it as taking their jobs. It's actually deeper than that. In many cases, they perceive it as failing to recognize the special skill set that they require for their jobs. I've heard in more than one case, individuals saying all of this technology has no empathy, that it can't sense empathy, and that that's an important quality in the situation with border. And I know we may not all think, you know, border guards empathetic, but I think it does happen, and that, so they're often on the same page, so that's the other dynamic that we have going there. Where on the one side they're saying we don't want this, but other aspects of that want other things.